Arthur Thompson wasn't just another Glasgow gangster. He was the city's undisputed godfather, a man who ruled for over 3 decades with iron fists and blood-soaked fear. Rivals were tortured, debtors were nailed to floors, and silence was the law. But in 1991, the violence turned inward. His own son was executed on their doorstep. It was the beginning of the end, and no one saw it coming. Arthur Thompson was born in September 1931 in the working-class district of Springburn, Glasgow. It was a city reeling from war, poverty, and unemployment. For a boy like Arthur, survival meant strength and fearlessness. He grew up fast. By the time he hit his teens, Thompson had already made a name for himself as a brutal street fighter. He wasn't the biggest, but he fought to maim. His flattened nose and scarred fists told their own story. In his early 20s, he began working as an enforcer for loan sharks. But Thompson wasn't content taking orders. He struck out on his own, building a loan sharking operation where repayment wasn't optional and punishments were legendary. Debtors who crossed him were literally crucified, nailed to floors or doors as a message to others. That method earned him a chilling reputation and a nickname whispered across Glasgow's housing estates. By the late 1950s, Thompson's ambition outgrew his city. He moved briefly into London's criminal scene, reportedly rubbing shoulders with the infamous Cray twins. One account claims he stormed into their club, gun in hand, declaring, "I'm Arthur Thompson from Glasgow, remember my name." Fact or fiction, it cemented his myth. Back in Glasgow, Thompson expanded into armed robbery, extortion, and protection rackets. His name became synonymous with fear. In 1960, he served 18 months for extortion, but that would be one of his few convictions. He knew how to stay insulated. When he got out, he began laundering profits through pubs, nightclubs, and taxi firms, always fronted by others, never in his own name. His grip on Glasgow tightened. He built connections across Britain's underworld, not just with enforcers and thieves, but with politicians and corrupt officials. And his empire, centered in Provanmill, became an impenetrable fortress. But where there is power, there is threat. By the mid-60s, a rival crew from Black Hill, the Welsh family, was rising. A gang war was brewing. And Thompson was ready. This was no longer about money. It was about dominance, survival, legacy. And Thompson would do whatever it took to stay on top. What came next would make Arthur Thompson one of Scotland's most feared and violent criminals. A man who would one day be called the Godfather of Glasgow. By 1966, Arthur Thompson had cemented his place as the undisputed kingpin of Glasgow's criminal underworld. His rivals were dead, silenced, or too afraid to challenge him. His empire stretched across drug routes, protection rackets, and illegal gambling. But it was his reputation, cold, ruthless, untouchable, that made him legendary. He didn't just run Glasgow's underworld, he owned it. Thompson's methods were as effective as they were brutal. Loan defaulters were nailed to floors, kneecapped, or worse. Enemies disappeared or ended up in hospital beds, unable to speak. Businesses paid him not just for protection, but to avoid destruction. Even the police, many believed, turned a blind eye. His influence extended to London, where he maintained ties with notorious gangsters like Mad Frankie Fraser and Billy Hill. Criminal circles knew his name and knew not to cross it. But in the summer of 1966, someone did. On a quiet night, Arthur was driving his MG sports car through Glasgow. Sitting in the passenger seat beside him was his mother-in-law, Maggie Johnston. As they crossed the city, a bomb planted beneath the passenger seat exploded, killing Maggie instantly. Arthur somehow survived. It was a declaration of war. Thompson's suspicions turned immediately to a rival family from Black Hill, the Welsh clan, a long-standing enemy in the city's gangland feuds. Days later, revenge arrived in daylight. While driving his Jaguar, Arthur spotted Patrick Welsh and James Goldie, both suspected of involvement in the bombing, riding in a van. Without hesitation, he rammed his car into them at full speed, sending the van careening into a lamppost. Both men were killed instantly. Police arrested Thompson and charged him with double murder. But the case collapsed. There were no witnesses, none willing to speak anyway. In a city ruled by silence, the Godfather walked free. The message was unmistakable. Kill one of his and he'd kill two of yours. Over the next 2 decades, Thompson only tightened his grip. His influence reached into clubs, bars, and entire housing estates. At the height of his power, he was rumored to be pulling in £100,000 per week from his loan and drug operations. Enforcement was simple: join him, obey him, or disappear. But change was coming, fast and violent. In the early 1980s, Arthur found a new protege, a young, vicious street enforcer from Black Hill named Paul Ferris. Ferris had grown up under siege from the Welsh clan, fighting back with razor blades, scalpings, and near-mythical brutality. Thompson saw potential. He brought Ferris into the fold, treating him like a son, or perhaps like a weapon. But even weapons turn. By the mid-1980s, enemies were circling. The drug trade was shifting. Gangs once too afraid to challenge Thompson now saw cracks in the empire. Then came the first real hit. In 1985, Arthur Thompson Sr. was ambushed. Outside the Ponderosa, the fortified Proven Mill compound that served as his family seat, he was shot in the groin at point-blank range. Bleeding heavily, Thompson staggered into his car and drove himself to a private hospital. When asked what happened, he claimed he'd slipped on a drill bit. No one believed it, but no one dared question him either. 3 years later, they tried again. In 1988, as Thompson walked home from a pub, a car suddenly mounted the pavement and pinned him against a fence. 2 men jumped out, firing 3 shots at close range. Miraculously, all missed. As they fled, the attackers dropped a pistol at the scene, trying to make it look like Arthur had been armed. He survived, but the message was clear. His enemies weren't finished, and this time he named one. Thompson went to court and accused his former protege, Paul Ferris, of orchestrating the attack. It was an unthinkable betrayal, the kind that signaled a civil war within the empire. Ferris denied it. The streets buzzed with rumors. Some said Ferris had ambitions of his own. Others believed he was being set up. Either way, blood had already been spilled, and more was coming, because in 1991 the war turned inward, and Arthur Thompson's enemies found the ultimate way to strike back. By the early 1990s, Arthur Thompson was aging, but he was still feared, still powerful. His family empire, now run alongside his eldest son, Arthur Thompson Jr., was earning millions from heroin and protection rackets. The younger Thompson, nicknamed Fat Boy for his heavy-set frame, had inherited his father's ruthlessness, but not his discipline. He was brash, flamboyant, and violent, a dangerous combination. Arthur Sr. had groomed him to be the heir, but the empire wasn't built to last. On August 18, 1991, Arthur Jr. was granted a weekend release from Northside Prison, where he was serving time for drug offenses. It should have been a routine furlough, a quiet visit home. Instead, it became the moment that changed Glasgow's criminal landscape forever. That night, just hours after leaving prison, Arthur Jr. pulled up outside the Ponderosa, the family's fortress-like compound in Proven Mill. He had just collected a takeaway curry and was walking toward the house when a team of gunmen struck. 3 shots rang out in the dark. The first bullet grazed his cheek, tearing a deep slice across his face. The second ripped into his side, puncturing a lung. The third, the kill shot, was fired at close range into his lower back, reportedly through the anus, a cruel signature common in gangland executions, meant to degrade even in death. Arthur Jr. collapsed on the pavement. Inside the house, Arthur Sr. heard the gunfire. He rushed outside to find his son bleeding, crawling, and gasping for air. Fat Boy died in his father's arms, on the very steps of the empire they had built together. The most feared gangster in Glasgow, cradling his dying son. The symbolism was unmistakable. The heir to the Thompson dynasty had been assassinated just feet from the home that was supposed to be impenetrable. The Godfather had been touched, and the underworld knew it. Panic spread through Glasgow's gangland. Phones rang. Guns were loaded. The message was clear. This wasn't business. This was war. But the retaliation was already in motion. The next morning, just hours before Fat Boy's funeral, police made a grim discovery. On a street just blocks from the Ponderosa, a car was found abandoned. Inside were the bodies of Bobby Glover and Joe "Bananas" Hamlin, 2 known associates of Paul Ferris. Both had been executed, each shot twice in the back of the head. A 3rd bullet had been fired into each victim's anus, echoing the same degrading method used on Arthur Jr. This time, though, the twist was crueler still. The car had been left on the planned route of Arthur Jr.'s funeral procession, positioned so the hearse would pass the corpses. It was a direct provocation, a final insult, daring the Thompsons to escalate, and they did. That afternoon, as mourners gathered for the funeral, a bomb threat was phoned in to Riddery Cemetery. Police cleared the grounds. Snipers were stationed on rooftops. Armed officers stood guard at every corner. It felt less like a funeral, more like a military standoff. No bomb was found, but the psychological damage was done. This wasn't just a gang feud anymore. It was a full-scale criminal meltdown, with the city of Glasgow caught in the crossfire. At the center of the chaos was one name, Paul Ferris, once Thompson's enforcer, now allegedly his greatest enemy. Police moved quickly. Within days of Arthur Jr.'s murder, Ferris was arrested and charged. He was accused not only of the murder of Fat Boy, but also of conspiring in the deaths of Glover and Hanlon. The theory: Ferris had used the 2 men to carry out the hit, then had them silenced to erase evidence. Ferris denied everything, but the streets were divided. Some believed he had betrayed the man who raised him. Others insisted he was being framed by the Thompsons to cover up internal power struggles. Either way, the bloodshed had reached its peak. The 1991 murder of Arthur Jr., followed by the execution of his suspected killers, marked the most violent and public chapter in Glasgow's gangland history. It was raw, fast, and personal. Not just a hit, but a vendetta, an empire tearing itself apart. What had begun with bombs in the 1960s ended with bodies and coffins by the 90s. The media called it Scotland's Mafia War. Locals called it something else, the end of the old order. Because after 1991, nothing in Glasgow's underworld would ever be the same. The murder of Arthur Thompson, Jr. didn't just devastate a family. It triggered one of the most high-profile police investigations in Scottish history. The victim was the heir to Glasgow's most feared criminal dynasty. The streets were erupting. The public was terrified. And law enforcement had no choice but to act fast. Just days after the funeral, Paul Ferris was arrested. Police charged him with the murder of Arthur Jr. and the alleged double murder of Bobby Glover and Joe Hanlon. According to prosecutors, Ferris had ordered the hit on his former mentor's son, then had the two gunmen killed to silence them. It was a theory built on betrayal, and it would become the center of one of Scotland's most dramatic court cases. The trial began in 1992 at the High Court in Glasgow, under intense media scrutiny. It was Scotland's version of the Mafia trials, a bloody saga of underworld violence playing out in the courtroom. At the heart of it was Arthur Thompson, Sr., now an aging but still formidable figure, who took the stand to testify against Ferris. In court, Thompson stared down his former enforcer, accusing him of orchestrating the assassination. Ferris, stone-faced, denied every word. The defense claimed Ferris had been set up, that the evidence was circumstantial, and that the Thompson empire was crumbling, with Arthur Sr. desperate to deflect the spotlight. Over 54 days, jurors heard stories of gangland codes, torture methods, and vendettas that stretched back decades. But the prosecution's case struggled. The forensic evidence was thin. Witnesses were unreliable or too afraid to speak. And without the two alleged gunmen, Glover and Hanlon, alive to testify, doubt lingered. On March 10, 1992, the jury delivered its verdict, not guilty. Paul Ferris walked free. The fallout was seismic. Arthur Thompson, now in his 60s, had lost his son, his case, and control over Glasgow's criminal landscape. Just a year later, on March 13, 1993, the Godfather himself died of a heart attack at his home in Provenmill. No bullets. No bombs, just the quiet ending of a man who had spent decades knee-deep in blood. His funeral drew hundreds, gangsters, mourners, the curious, all gathered to bury a legend. But behind the black suits and floral wreaths, one thing was clear: the empire had fallen. Without Arthur Sr., the Thompson grip on Glasgow collapsed. The void left behind led to a new wave of violence, as younger, more volatile gangs fought for territory. The days of old-school order gave way to chaotic turf wars, drive-by shootings, and a drug trade spiraling out of control. Yet the legend of Arthur Thompson endures. To some, he was a cold-blooded killer who built an empire on pain. To others, a necessary evil who kept worse forces in check. But one truth remains: Arthur Thompson lived and died by the code of the underworld. And his story is a chilling reminder that every criminal empire, no matter how feared, eventually falls. Arthur Thompson rose from the slums of Springbourne to become Glasgow's most feared crime lord. For over 3 decades, his name meant silence, obedience, and fear. He ruled with nails, bullets, and brutality, turning the city's streets into battlegrounds. But in the end, even the Godfather couldn't outrun time. His empire crumbled. His enemies survived, and his family legacy bled out in broad daylight. The streets of Glasgow will never forget the man who once made them run red with blood. The events described in this video are based on publicly available information, court records, and news reports. All individuals mentioned are considered innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. This content is intended for educational and documentary purposes only.